Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are now up to the laws of the second tithe, chapter 2. In order to see where we are up to, let us take a look at our Thursday slideshow. We are learning the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. He called it Mishnah Torah because it comes from the word Shini, which means second. And he said, once you've read the Chumash, the next thing you can learn is the Rambam. The Chumash will give you the written law, and the Rambam will give you all of the oral law. Now, the Mishnah Torah has 14 volumes. It's referred to as the Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand, because Yad in Hebrew equals 14. Chai equals 18. Yad equals 14. So it's referred to as a strong hand of 14 volumes. We've learned the book of knowledge and love and times, the laws relating to marriage and divorce, holiness, promises, and now we are almost near the end of the book of seeds, which has to do with all food-related halachas. So we are in the 7th volume. It has 7 subjects. It has 85 chapters in this whole volume. And we are now up to chapter, let's take a look. We are now up to Ma'aser Sheni, which is the 5th topic in the book of Zra'im. It has 11 chapters. We began learning it yesterday, and so we'll be learning it until, please God, the end of next week. So we've learned about forbidden mixtures, we've learned about gifts to the poor, gifts to the Kohanim, the first 10%, and now we are learning about the second 10%. What still comes ahead of us is Bikurim, first fruits, and Shemitah, the sabbatical year. But for now, let's take a look at Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe. Now, really, it's called both Ma'aser Sheni and Neter Avai, the second tithe and the 4th year fruits. As we have learned, and we will learn soon, there is a mitzvah not to eat the fruits from a tree that grow in its first 3 years. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's take a look at today's chapter. So here we are. There are 11 chapters. The first 3 chapters will define Ma'aser Sheni and teach us how it can be consumed. Then we'll have another 2 chapters that speak about redeeming it over the weekend, the beginning of next week. Then we'll speak more about mixtures and doubts. That can kind of get confusing, but just 1 chapter on that. We'll speak about using Ma'aser money. Now, this doesn't mean the 10% you give for tzedakah. It means money, which we'll learn about it when you get there. But it's money to which is connected with this Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe. And then we'll learn about 0 to 4-year-old trees, and finally, confession and disposal that relates to the second tithe. So for today, we are still in chapter number 2. We are defining what Ma'aser Sheni is and how it may be consumed. This is today's chapter. There are 16 halachas. Let's put this on the side, and we will follow along the text.
We don't see the text yet, Rabbi.
I will repost that. Did you see what I was just telling you, though?
Yeah, yes.
Up until now, you see where it says on the top, Ma'aser Sheni second tithe?
No.
You don't? Oh, no. Okay. So just to rewind a moment, we are... Yes, so we are now in the topic of Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe. I went through the 11 chapters. And today we are doing chapter number 2. Okay, you see that over there. Good.
Yes, now we can see it.
No, good.
Okay. Good. Okay. So the second tithe, let me make the text a little bit bigger. Okay, the second tithe. So just to remind ourselves what the second tithe is. So when a person had a farm or a field and they harvested the produce, so they would need to separate 10% and give it to the Leviim, to the Levites. And of the 90% that was left, he would need to separate another 10%, which would now be 10% of the 90%, which would be 9% of the sum total. And this would need to be eaten in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. So the first 10% would go to the Levi, and the next 9% would be given, he would eat himself, but he would eat it in Jerusalem. Okay, so that's what we're learning about. Yesterday we heard in the basics about the second tithe and how it's eaten in Jerusalem. Now we're giving some more details, some more information. So firstly, it needs to be eaten in Jerusalem. And what do we do nowadays? So it needs to be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim, as the Torah says, and you shall eat it before Hashem, your Lord, in the place he chooses to cause his name to dwell. Since it says we should eat it before Hashem, in the place he chooses for his name to dwell, our rabbis infer that this means that it needs to be eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. Now, this that it needs to be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem, or let's put it this way. This that it needs to be within the walls of Jerusalem applies whether the Beis Hamikdash is standing or not, meaning that would apply nowadays. Because even though the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem still retains its holiness. The holiness of Jerusalem is never nullified, even when the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. So now it's still a holy place. Nevertheless, we only eat this second tithe if the Beis Hamikdash is standing. As the Torah says, the tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your cattle or your sheep, which the oral tradition teaches, just as the firstborn is not eaten except when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, the firstborn cattle that is, so to the second tithe is not eaten except when the temple is standing. So what do? We say it needs to be in Jerusalem, but we say we can't eat it in Jerusalem nowadays because we don't have a Beis Hamikdash. So what should be done? So it is pious behavior, meaning going beyond the letter of the law, to redeem the second tithe for its full value in the same manner as it should be redeemed while the Beis Hamikdash stood. So you would redeem it. So you would take, let's say you had 100 kilos of wheat. So the first 10 kilos you'd give to the Levi. The next 9 kilos, you're not going to actually eat it in Jerusalem because we don't have a temple, but you would actually take those 9 kilos and then take, let's say it cost 100 rand a kilo, you would take 900 rand and you would transfer the specialty of those 9 kilos of wheat onto 900 rand. Our sages, however, rule that in the present age, if one desires, he may redeem a manna's worth of produce for a prutta. A manna is like 100 silver coins. A prutta is a very small amount of money, probably a couple of rands. So nowadays, since the Beis Hamikdash doesn't stand, even if you took 9 kilos of wheat, your second tithe, and you redeemed it over a 50 rand bull, that would also work. But this produce need not be considered more stringently than consecrated property, and that prutta should be discarded. So we separate it, but we don't consume it. So what do? We discard it. So we're not going to actually throw out 9 kilograms of wheat. That's if the whole field only produced 100 kilos of wheat. What happens if the field produced 100 tons of wheat? So we're not going to throw out 9 tons of wheat. Rather, we'll redeem it. So, and it's sufficient to redeem it even over the smallest amount of money. So you would take out a 50 rand note and you would say that you are redeeming these 9 tons of wheat on this 50 rand note, and then you would, or coin, and you would throw that into the garbage, you would discard it. Similarly, I said 100 rand notes, although money, I don't know if it has intrinsic value. I think it's kind of like a check. It tells you what it corresponds to. I'm not sure. But he speaks about an actual little coin. But I think that's probably how it would be done. You would say that whatever the second tithe, those 9 tons, 9 kilos are being redeemed with this bull of money, and then you discard that money, even if it's that therefore it could even be a small amount. Okay, if I transfer the holiness of a month's worth of produce, that is the second tithe for a printer's worth of other produce, the holiness is transferred. So if you said, I'm going to transfer the holiness from these 9 tons of wheat onto these 5 kilograms of pomegranates, so then that would be transferred. But then you would need to throw out those pomegranates because we can't eat it now. So you would probably want to do it on a minimal amount. I'm not sure. You should then burn the produce to which you transfer the holiness so that it will not present an obstacle to others. Because now that you transferred the 9 tons of wheat to these 5 pomegranates, somebody might come and eat it. But we're not allowed to eat the second tithe when the base of Mikdash does not stand. So therefore it should be destroyed. As a redemption of Neter Avai, which we'll speak about, or we have spoken about previously, which was the fruits that grow in the 4th year. By the way, this is all for farms in Israel. The obligation to separate tithes, second tithe, does not apply to farms in the diaspora. Okay, now halacha number 4. So just as we don't partake of the second tithe in the present area in Yerushalayim, so too we don't redeem it there, nor transfer its holiness. So we don't eat it there, and we shouldn't redeem it while it's there, or sell it. If produce, which is the second tithe, is brought into Jerusalem in the present era, then once it's brought there, it should stay. So we're going to see in the chapters that follow, there's this idea that once the second tithe enters Jerusalem, it stays there. It doesn't leave. So we would have to leave it there until it rots. Similarly, if one transgressed and removed it from there, he would need to leave it until it rots. So we have this interesting phenomena where it still has a specialty, but we can't eat it. So unfortunately, it needs to be rot. Needs to be left to rot, which is another reason that we daven for Mashiach, and we'll have the base of Mikdash once again, and we will be able to eat of this produce. For this reason, we do not separate the second tithe in the present area in Yerushalayim. Instead, we remove the produce from the city while it is tevel and redeem it. Okay, so let me explain what this means. It means if you have a wheat farm in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, so if you're going to separate your second tithe in Jerusalem, let's say your farm is producing 100 tons of wheat. If you're going to separate those second tithe, those 9 tons of wheat in Jerusalem, then that will all have to be destroyed, which would be terrible. So what we do is instead we transport all 100 tons out of Jerusalem. And if we separate the second tithe while it is outside of Jerusalem, then it can be redeemed unto a very small value, which can be discarded. Okay, now back to temple times. We're going to see that the Torah says that the second tithe needs to be eaten in Jerusalem, and there's a separate mitzvah which says that it may not be eaten outside of Jerusalem. Anyone who eats an olive-sized portion of produce from the second tithe, or drinks a revius of wine from the second tithe, outside the walls of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim, would need to receive lashes, punishment. As the Torah says, in your gates, you may not partake of the tithe of your grain, your wine, or your oil outside the gates. He is liable for lashes for each one individually. So the Torah mentions 3 things over here: grain, wine, and oil. If a person was to eat grain, wine, and oil, he would receive a separate punishment for each of the 3. Therefore, if he partakes of the 3 outside the walls of Jerusalem, he would be liable for 3 sets of lashes. As it says, and he shall eat it before Hashem, the place he chooses. Okay, whether the base of English is standing or it's not standing, Rafi, du willst kommen da rein? Also darfst aufhören lehnen. Darfst einstellen. Rafi, get das hier. And must be observed whether the temple is standing or it is not standing. Nevertheless, we partake of it only while the base of Mikdash is standing, as the Torah says. So again, we need to separate it in all times, but we can only eat it when we have a base of Mikdash. As the Torah says, you should eat it, the tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil. You may not partake of the tithe of the grain, your wine, and your oil. Why does it say it? Mention each individually to say that one would be punished on account of each of the 3. If a person was to eat wine, oil, and grains, he would receive punishment for each of those 3 things individually. Okay, now according to Torah law, one only would receive lashes if he partook of this produce once it had already entered Jerusalem. and then was removed. So it has to be eaten in Jerusalem. If it was brought into Jerusalem and then subsequently removed, and then he ate it outside, he would receive lashes. As the Torah says, you may not partake in your gates, and you shall not eat before God. Since the produce enters the place where it should be eaten, and then it was eaten outside, one receives lashes. If, however, one ate such produce before it reached Jerusalem, so the second tithe was separated, but it hadn't yet been brought to Jerusalem, he would only be given stripes of rebellion, which is rabbinic stripes, which isn't as serious. Okay, what happens if some of it came into Jerusalem and some of it was still stuck outside? So if he eats from that which didn't yet enter the city, then he would be given rabbinic lashes. If he ate from the portion that did enter the city, he would be given scriptural lashes. Okay. Now, once the food, so let's say you're back to temple times. So you've got a farm and you've got 100 ton of grain, and now 9 grain you're bringing to Jerusalem. You've already learned, or we will learn, that you don't have to actually transport all those 9 tons of grain to Jerusalem. You can actually redeem it on cash and bring the cash to Jerusalem. So this process of redeeming can be done before those 9 tons reach Jerusalem. But once the second tithe reaches Jerusalem, then it needs to be eaten as is. It cannot be transferred. So as the Torah says, if the place will be distant from you, meaning that you could only redeem it while you're not there yet. If a person is inside Jerusalem and his burden is outside, even if he's carrying it on a pole, so although he is in, since the produce is still out, it can be redeemed. Okay, now we're going to learn about the prohibition that we're not allowed to take produce that entered Jerusalem out of Jerusalem. So once produce from the second tithe, even if it's demai, which means we're not sure if it is or isn't, is brought into Jerusalem. Once the produce was brought into town, then it cannot leave. If it's there to stay. Because it's already been absorbed, so to speak, by the walls of the city. Similar concepts apply with regards to produce purchased with money of the second tithe in Jerusalem. If he took such produce out, then it needs to be returned to be eaten in Jerusalem. So if a person redeemed his 9 ton of wheat on whatever it was, 9,000 rand, and he brought the 9,000 rand to Jerusalem, and then he bought, while he was in Jerusalem, he went and he bought himself a nice meal, the fanciest restaurants, because that money can be spent in Jerusalem. So once he's redeemed that 9,000 rand on a kosher McDonald's and everything else, then that kosher McDonald's cannot be removed from Jerusalem, because once it was bought with money of the second tithe in Jerusalem, it needs to stay there. If it was removed, it needs to be brought back. The concept of produce from the second tithe that was bought in Jerusalem is taken by its partitions is a rabbinic decree. Even produce from the redemption of the second tithe whose fifth is not worth a pruta, which is observed a rabbinic decree, is taken by the walls and should not be removed. In other words, it was the rabbis that said once it's there, it stays there. What do they say about Vegas? What comes here stays here. What goes on here stays here. See, everything in this world has a source in Torah. You think it was Vegas that came up with that? What goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. That's the way it spiraled out of control in a negative sense, perhaps. But in the positive sense, it all starts with Jerusalem, with Yerushalayim. The rabbi said that what comes into Yerushalayim stays in Jerusalem. If you bought the kosher McDonald's in Jerusalem, you cannot take it back with you to Haifa, to Tel Aviv. Because what comes in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem. But money from the redemption of the second tithe may be brought in and out. So if a person took his 9 ton of wheat and transferred it to 9,000 rand, and then he has his wallet on him and he's carrying a lot of cash. I mean, 9,000 rand is what, like $50. Okay, we won't talk about that now. But either way, once he brings that money into Jerusalem, he can take it back out, because it's only once it is used to purchase produce do we say that the produce cannot be removed. But if it's money, money can come in and it can go out. And I guess that's, in the origins, that's where things are better than the way they are in Vegas, because that's the way it will always be. When things are in their source in holiness, that's good. But when it gets when it has its offshoots in other places, then it's not as nice as the source at all. It's the other side. So in the Torah source, money that goes in does come back out. It's only the produce. When produce, just try to keep it. We should always serve Hashem with joy. Rava, says one of the great sages, Rava, before he started teaching, he'd crack a joke. By no means a comedian, but certainly to keep it humorous is a good thing. You can help me at that. Okay, but more on another two halachas, that what comes in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem. So when produce for which the tasks involved in its preparation have been completed is taken through Jerusalem and then removed. Okay, so you had your 100 kilos of wheat and you haven't yet separated the second time, but you're traveling. And you're traveling from, let's say, what's all the way? From Jordan to, to Ashdod. You're taking a shipment, you have a truckload that's traveling from Jordan to Ashdod, and you're passing through Jerusalem. So you're not just carrying with you the second tithe. You have your whole farm supply of wheat, and the truth is it needs to be the other way around, because if it comes from Jordan, then you don't need to separate anything. Unless the truth is part of Jordan actually is part of biblical Israel, which is another whole discussion. But let's say it was the other way around. You had a convoy of trucks that were taking wheat from Ashdod down into Jordan, and it was passing through Jerusalem. So what now? So we haven't yet separated our second tithe, but we did say what comes to Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem. So we're going to say that once those trucks get on the roads passing through Jerusalem, do we say that they're stuck? They can go no further? So he says the owner, when he does separate the second tithe, so he cannot separate the second tithe from other produce. Instead, the second tithe from this produce should be separated and returned and eaten in Jerusalem. So if those 10 trucks of wheat pass through Jerusalem, then if it's 10 trucks, so then 10%, then one truck should actually stay there. Once the produce went through Jerusalem, then the second tithe should be brought back to Jerusalem. It cannot be redeemed outside the city. So you cannot redeem it, you need to actually eat it. Even if one designates the entire quantity of produce which was removed as the second tithe for produce that was not yet brought to Jerusalem, it must be returned and eaten in that city. This is a stringency associated with the walls of Jerusalem. Once produce is taken in, it has to be taken in. Again, what comes stays. So if you've got a whole truckload of wheat, not all the wheat needs to be eaten in Jerusalem because only 10% does, but that 10% would actually need to stay in Jerusalem even though they were just driving through. And one final point on this prohibition of taking out of Jerusalem, when produce for which the tasks involved in its preparation have not been completed. So you don't have, the produce isn't ready for sale. For example, you have baskets of grapes that are being taken to the vat. So maybe my example of wheat is also good because it wasn't a good one because it hasn't yet been made into flour. Okay, but if it's not ready yet, like baskets of grapes that are still going to the vat, or baskets of figs that are being taken to dry, so since the product isn't ready yet, you can transport it through Jerusalem. And then you would be able to still, when you separate the second time, you would be able to redeem it on money and bring the money to Jerusalem. You wouldn't need to bring the food itself. Same would go for the second time from produce that is Dubai. Since Dubai, we're actually not sure whether it requires a separation or not. We are more lenient. We say that you would be able to redeem it on cash. Okay, the next two halachos speak about what happens if the second tithe became impure. It was touched by somebody that had become impure. So this is somewhat holy. So what now? So produce from the second tithe which became impure in Jerusalem, was redeemed. So although we said you cannot, once it comes in Jerusalem, it stays there, you cannot redeem it, that's regular produce. But if it became impure, then you can redeem it. If it became impure through contact with a secondary source of impurity, so this is now like back to COVID things, like were you in direct contact with the person that had COVID, or you in contact with somebody that's in quarantine? Then back to the source. If the reason that the second time became impure was through a second degree form of contact, then that's only rabbinically forbidden. It should be eaten within the city. Sorry, if it became biblically contaminated, so then you are allowed to redeem it. But if it only became rabbinically contaminated, then you may not take it out of the city. If it became impure as a result of contact with the primary source of impurity, or became impure outside the city, even through contact with the secondary source of impurity, then it can be redeemed. Let's move along. When does the above apply? When it was brought in with intent that the walls take it in. If, however, he did not make such a that the walls will not take it in. If he didn't make such a stipulation, then once it comes in, it stays there. Even though it became impure only by, since it became impure only by rabbinic law, so therefore it doesn't have complete license to leave. 3 more halachas. I see that we've already hit half past 1. Let's try to wrap it up. So just in summary, halacha 14 speaks about 2 unique types of produce. One is called chiltis or chilba, and the other one is called vetch. And these are fruits that are like, chilba is eaten in a raw state, and that's how it can be eaten as a second time. Vetch has its own category altogether. It speaks about dough made from vetch, which can be removed because it's not an ordinary produce. And the final 2 halachas is an interesting one. What happens if you're half in, you're half out? Right? If you're on 2 sides of the fence in South Africa, you might get electrocuted. What happens if you're on 2 sides of the wall of Jerusalem? So 2 scenarios. If you have a tree, the tree is in Jerusalem, the bark is in Jerusalem, but the shade is outside of Jerusalem. So the shade of that tree does not extend Jerusalem, and therefore you wouldn't be allowed to eat the second time under its shade. But you can't eat there. But on the other hand, it does already grab the produce, meaning that if produce was brought there, it should no longer be redeemed. As far as homes, so which side of the wall are they on, and which side are they facing? So if the entrances are within the wall, but the house is actually built on the outside of the wall, so whatever's within the wall would be considered as Jerusalem. But the whatever part of the house is outside the wall, so you wouldn't be able to eat Maisa Sheni over there as a stringency. But at the same time, if produce reached that space, it shouldn't be redeemed. So it's kind of like a gray zone. In the reverse, if the length of the house is in the walls, but the entrance is on the outside of the walls, so the portion that's outside is outside. And so you would be able to redeem produce there, you cannot eat there. The portion of the house that's inside, again, it's a gray zone because the house is inside, but the entrance is on the outside. So you wouldn't eat Maisa Sheni there, but you wouldn't redeem it either. Okay, let's quickly take a look at the test. Oh, I have a mistake, clicked on the answer. Let's go to number 2. How should Maisa Sheni be redeemed nowadays? For its full value? Even in the first instance, less than its value? Or if it's brought to Jerusalem, it should be redeemed for its number 2. Nowadays, you can redeem it for less than its full value. What is the punishment for one who consumed Maisa Sheni before it entered Jerusalem? So that will only be stripes of rebellion. The scriptural punishment is only once it's entered Jerusalem. And finally, question number 4. When may Maisa Sheni be redeemed in Jerusalem if it is impure? Okay, thank you so much for joining.